Okay, greetings. So my background concern has been to articulate an engineering worldview. And here, more specifically on what I'm reporting on my investigation, has to do with the ontology of the engineering worldview. I'm trying to answer the question, what is the world made of in the engineering worldview? So there we go. So my thesis in this is that reality is intelligible in terms of a participatory engineering worldview, and that the structures and functions of reality are technological creations. A secondary but key question is going to be the relation between the scientific worldview and the engineering worldview. Just to get started, I like this image from George Bugliarello, master engineer, and he argued that engineers should be taught that engineering is a natural extension of biological evolution. So that suggests, I think, that evolution has been and continues to be an engineering enterprise. Now, this isn't actually a historically radical position. It's the same position, I think, that Plato articulates in Timaeus, and the engineering design of the demiurge is what how reality is composed. So it's translated usually as a master engineer, which I translate as the engineer, master craftsman engineer. So I'm going to take this in 5 steps, is the way I've broken it down. First, I'm just going to go over a little bit of the modern, what I take to be the modern engineering worldview. Now I'm going to look at what I've been looking at as the uniformitarian debate, particularly between Charles Lyell and George Cuvier, which I think is illuminating. And then I'm going to just review sort of the metaphysics of the historical sciences versus the general sciences. And then I want to focus a bit on complementarity as it's arisen in modern science. Then I'm going to go back and take a look at 17th century engineering, particularly Leibniz and Carnot. And I think that's going to illuminate the question, and that will bring us back, hopefully with a better understanding, to step 1, which is people. So again, George's argument, reality is composed of, I take it that reality then is composed of intelligent embodied technologies. Because what engineering does is to create technologies, and I want to say that these technologies are intelligent, and of course they're embodied, they're part of reality, or they are reality. So here are some examples of embodied technology, structure and function, and I'm going to say they're intelligent. And what I mean by intelligent here is that they're able to do things. They don't just have a structure and stuff, but they can actually do things. The dog can catch the frisbee, the cheetah can catch the antelope. So it's not just that they have a structure and function, but they actually do things, and that doing is intelligent. And I always say, of course, that their structure is intelligent as well. And here's some others. And the Earth, I want to suggest, as of the Gaia hypothesis, that the Earth is, in fact, itself a living system, is an embodied technology. Okay, so in my first step, I want to take, besides George Bugliarello, I want to look at Walter Vincente, who I think is seminal in all this. And Vincente makes an epistemological challenge to science. And he says, most engineers are seen as taking over their knowledge from scientists, and by some occasionally dramatic, but probably intellectually uninteresting process, using this knowledge to fashion material artifacts. So from this point of view, studying the epistemology of science would automatically subsume the knowledge content of engineering. And then he says, engineers know from experience that this is untrue. Engineering knowledge is not derivative from science, but an autonomous body of knowledge. Engineering is not merely applied science. Aeroplanes which is Vincenti's specialty, are not designed by science, but by art, in spite of some pretense and humbug to the contrary. The creative, constructive knowledge of the engineer is the knowledge needed to implement that art. So engineers understand the technological, I would argue now, engineers understand the technological structures and functions of reality in a way that is beyond scientific knowledge. Engineering epistemology then also entails that there's an engineering ontology. So I'm going to put forth here a hypothesis, and that is that the best single image of the engineering ontology is the engine. And the engine is something that by its very nature can't be understood in terms of the scientific framework. And the reason for that is the scientific framework is conservative and the engineering framework is generative. So these are some of Vincenti's technologies. Again, embodied, intelligent. They embody intelligent design, and they allow us to do things. And of course, the city is example, the whole thing. Okay, so government. These are all embodied intelligence. One questions the level of intelligence in the Congress, but there we go. So. There are two other engineers that I want to review. One is Sam Florman. Sam is a major contributor, and he has this book called The Existential Pleasures of Engineering. And what he points at is that there's the existential character of engineering practice. And he goes back to the European existentialist movement and so forth, and roughly saying we are instantiated, we find ourselves instantiated in reality with the ability to act, to do things, but we have no script. So here we are to be able to act, but we don't know what we're supposed to be doing. So engineers have options, a sort of constrained free will. They can't do anything, but they have options presented to them. You're constantly in this existential situation to decide what to do this way or that way, and that's sort of like the embodied free will. And the Europeans found angst in this. Florman sees it as a creative opportunity to actualize future reality. And I think I associate this with, in the Timaeus, he's asked, how did the world come to be as it is? And Timaeus says, I can only give you a probable account of how it came to be. And I think the reason that is because it's not teleonomic, as we say these days. It's not it doesn't evolve by a plan that can be pre-specified and so forth. Anyway, okay, so the last guy, if engineering practice is existential, then what is the agenda of engineering? It is nothing. And Herb Simon and others say, there is something called the problem of engineering, or the problem of design, which is what engineers are about. And what is the problem? The problem, Simon puts it, is to move from a current state of affairs to a more desirable future state of affairs. Now, there's values implicit in that definition. And so I associate this again with the Timaeus, where Timaeus says, although I can go and give you a probable account, he said, but the world certainly always moves to the good. So this is the same thing. So the agenda is moving towards the good. So these are, I quite like Kevin Kelly's book, and this is another book that expresses the same thing. Okay, so my step 2 now, I want to look at the uniformitarian debate. And the focus of the debate is, can reality be completely and consistently accounted for in terms of the uniform scientific worldview? And Lyle says yes, Cuvier says no. Cuvier's alternative, I'm going to argue, is in fact an engineering worldview. And hopefully this debate illuminates the relationship between the scientific and engineering worldviews, because these are the two sides and they're debating it. And it will also help us to understand why science tends to ignore the engineering worldview. Now, the two issues in the, I'll look at my notes here. Now, the two issues in the uniformity debate that I want to separate, one has to do with the chronology of reality and its sort of how did it come to be over time. And the other one has to do with the uniformity of space. In other words, this is more about the, number 2 is about the ontology. And how does it come to be as it is in Timaeus, of course, the question he's put to. And he suggests it's not a uniform process because it's not, there is no, it's not teleonomic, there is no uniform plan, it doesn't go step by step, it's a bit messier than that. And on the ontological question, the question is reality uniform, or does it have a structure and function? So are there differences, and there's a structure there? And this is also then the whole of Timaeus is about that stuff too. So the debate is fueled between Lyell and Cuvier, is fueled in part, this is sort of symbolic, there are a lot of things going on, but there's this canal digger, William Smith, who documents the geological structures, layers, strata throughout the United Kingdom. And Smith comes up with what he calls a principle of faunal succession, because he noticed that the organic remains found in each of the strata are quite unique to each strata, and he sees them as getting more complicated as in the more recent strata. So, and there's also, before, I want to be historian here a little bit, before Lyell, there's this guy James Hutton who puts forth all this stuff and argues that the geological features perpetually transform over a long period of time. Processes operating today are the same everywhere and in the past. So the little catchphrase that everybody used was the present is the key to the past. So if I want to understand the past, I can look at the present processes and say, oh, well, let's extrapolate these back, and that's the way it goes. So that's the sort of uniformity thing. Now, Lyell's is an enormously influential guy, and you'll perhaps recall that Lyell's Principles of Geology was one of the books that Newton took with him on his voyage. So the subtitle of the Principles of Geology is very telling. He says it's an attempt to explain the former changes of the Earth's surface by reference to causes now in operation. So what Lyell is really after here is he wants a scientific geology. He wants to get away from biblical floods and all that sort of stuff, and he wants to get down and say, let's be scientific about geology. We got a lot more. There's a huge amount of evidence. If you read, I read his 750-page version of the Principles that's current today. It wasn't the first volume, but it's revised multiple editions. So really interesting read. But anyway, that's just his aim. He wants a scientific geology, and basically that means he wants a geology that's law governed. Now, law governed ends up meaning same processes and the same laws over time and location. And I'll go into why that is a little bit more. The scientific version of that today, you hear from the cosmologists, they say the laws governing all phenomena of reality are time, space, and variance. So they're the same laws at the beginning of the Big Bang, and they're the same laws now, and they're the same laws now. So one thing that tells us is you don't really have to study history, because you just look at the current, what you learn about the way the world works currently allows you to understand how it worked 3 minutes after the Big Bang, and will go eventually. That's the basic, seems to be a background implication, if nothing else, of the scientific worldview. So the first question is the question of chronological direction. And what Lyell does is he comes up with this model of dynamic steady state, dynamic equilibrium. So you got volcanoes going up and weather bringing them down, the water and so forth, and these are two dynamic processes, and the net is that they are, more or less, Earth will always look the same. So it talks about the uniformity of state, and he argues there's no progress in any inexorable direction. Change is continuous. I like this. Change is continuous, but leads nowhere. And the Earth more or less always looked and behaved as it does now. And this also applies, that's geological, this applies to biological change, is also continuous but leads nowhere. And Lyell and Darwin were buddies. And of course, Darwin read Lyell's book back cover to cover probably several times. And Darwin was influenced by Lyell, and to the extent that Darwin envisioned evolution as a sort of biological uniformitarianism. And Darwin recognized, however, that the fossil evidence suggested a trend towards, quote, higher organisms. A great article by Michael Roos that goes into this in detail in the book called Complexity and the Arrow of Time. But the problem for Darwin was that there was nothing in his theory that indicated a direction, although so in other words, he admits that the evidence looks like there's a direction towards higher organism, but the Darwinian process doesn't suggest that or explain it. So he just says, well, that's just coincidence, or it could have been that way, but not necessarily. So I want to back Lyell's project. So if we take Galileo's ball drop experiment, he drops the ball in Pisa and you could do the same experiment in where I am in Beaverton, Oregon, and it's the same experiment. And so over differences in location and differences in time, same experiment. And that repeatability over changes in time and changes in location is central to what we mean by scientific knowledge and scientific laws. So arguably all experimental science, all scientific knowledge has this characteristic of repeatability over changes in time and location. And what that means is that these processes are time, space, invariant. So in Principles, Lyell undertakes to explain away, this expression in the philosophy of science literature, explain away the evidence of non-uniformities in space-time. And it's really fascinating. If I had a ton of time, I would go into it, but it's sort of like saying, so you think there are all these different individual trees and so forth, but if you step back and look at the forest, then you don't even see those. So it's like, and another example I have is John Barrow, old colleague, died unfortunately recently. Barrow he was trying to convince me one day that actually the cosmos is totally uniform. And what his idea is that the amount of matter in most of space is really, really light, sparse. So he says, now if you average over everything, then it's actually totally uniform. I go like, John, but what about the stars and the galaxies and stuff? He said, well, they're just not there. And that's the same sort of argument that Lyell uses. Anyway, okay, so, and one other, so I want to also say, as I pointed out, that this is not, Lyell's program for uniformity isn't the only thing that's trying to give a uniform scientific account of reality. And the one that I like in particular is what Hipparchus and Ptolemy did. And what they were approaching was they see all these different movements in the heaven, from the sun, the moon, the planets, everything, the seasons and so forth. And they want to get away from, all these, the gods are doing this and doing that. And so they wanted to show that it was all law governed. And Hipparchus in particular, and then Ptolemy follows up, just incredibly successful in going through and showing that the, motions of the planets and so forth were regular, the sun and the moon, you're enormously law governed and everything. So all this mumbo jumbo about making sacrifices to God is just nonsense. And one thing I want to say is that this is one of the things that goes on in this, trying to take an ideological uniformitarian position is this idea of taking the infinite limit. And so I was going to suggest that if you take the infinite limit of epicycles, then you, kind of like with John Barrow's argument, then you get the idea of complete uniformity. So here are a couple of reflections on this debate now. So I want to have you do a little thought experiment. I call it natural intuition. So I think it's a natural intuition, this is for me, that in every place is unique. Is every place unique? In other words, over here, over there, is there some uniqueness to each one of these places? And I also want to say every moment in time is unique. So today, yesterday, so forth, and like there's a uniqueness to everything. There's some sameness, but it's unique. There's a sort of an irreducible uniqueness to every place and every time. I think that's a natural intuition. But, okay, so, and this brings me to, I think, well, like, wait a minute, this is Parmenides and Heraclitus. So Parmenides, as you recall, says, we can speak and think only of what exists now. And what exists is uncreated and imperishable, for it is whole and unchanging and complete. It was not, nor shall be different, since it is now, all at once, one and continuous. This is, I mean, wonderful arguments to the one and everything. So everything's the same, everything's uniform, everything's, one thing. So and then Heraclitus, classical response is that, no one ever steps in the same river twice, for it's not the same river and he's not the same man. Nothing is, everything is becoming. There is nothing permanent except change. And this is, again, the being and becoming debate that, I think Aristotle's metaphysics is, I should call it 13 books struggling with the question of being and becoming. So that you get a bigger perspective on the debate there of what's going on. So the other one is Steve Gould wrote his first article in 1965, and it was titled, "Is Uniformitarian Necessary?" Now, Gould originally he gets his doctorate in geology. I mean, he's well known in evolution, but he got his doctorate in geology. And so in this article, he says, the assumption of spatial and temporal invariance of natural laws is by no means unique to geology, since it amounts to the warrant for inductive inference. This is a good insight. The basic mode of reasoning in empirical science. So if the universe is uniform, then inductive inference is good. But if the universe is not uniform, then it isn't. So he's saying this is not just about geology, this is about science. And I think he's right about that. And then he goes on, he says, without assuming the spatial and temporal invariance, we have no basis for extrapolating from the known to the unknown, and therefore no way of reaching general conclusions from a finite number of observations. Okay, I think it's deep insight that this is really about, scientific worldview completable and all that sort of stuff. But we certainly, so anyway, he makes a really good distinction in between, he calls it the methodological uniformitarianism and the substantial uniformitarianism. Methodological uniformitarianism, he says, is just essential to scientific inquiry. That's how we gather data and make inferences, inductive inferences. So, but the substantial thing, is did the universe, does it function in time identically, and is the ontology completely uniform? Those are completely refutable hypotheses. And he said we are committed to commitment to methodological uniformitarianism does not entail commitment to the completeness of the substantial uniformitarianism. And then he notes that it's an unfortunate consequence that a lot of geologists who've been trained in this stuff have conflated these two and been stifled by the belief that proper methodology includes a priori commitment to gradual change and for explaining large-scale phenomena as due to innumerable tiny changes like in time and space. I always like this. I don't know if you in grad school had to given this thing like science operates by the inductive inference. Inductive inference is not deductively valid. Please explain. So what Peirce said way back, he goes like, well, here's this link between uniformitarianism and induction. He says, if you look at it, what's missing in the inductive inference is an additional major premise that would make the inductive inference deductively valid, and that is the uniformity of nature. Okay, so I think, again, another insight into what's going on here. So now we're going to move on to after Lyell, we're going to move into Cuvier here, but to be historically reasonable, before Cuvier, there was this guy, Comte de Buffon, who really, put it all together in a way. He has a theory of the earth and has sort of referred to as, it's a biogeology, and he talks about the historic epics of the history of the earth. So he's not into uniformitarianism here. He's into, like, there's epics and there's a history. He actually is the first person, to, at least a big name, who questions the fixity of species and suggests transformationist theory. This is much prior to Darwin. His book was called Natural History of the General and the Particular. It has 36 volumes. So Ernst Mayr comments about it. He says, truly Buffon was the father of all thought in natural history in the second half of the 18th century. I mean, he was just voluminous, and he was very big deal and influential. So, but this guy is my hero, George Cuvier. And Cuvier really puts together what I'm calling an evolving technology model. So during this period when Smith was examining the strata in the UK, Cuvier was studying the geological strata around Paris. Cuvier discerned a developing trend in the fossils in the successive strata towards more sophisticated structures and functions. Okay, that was his argument. And he was instrumental in launching modern paleontology, suggesting a cumulative biological chronology. So I want to address it. Was Cuvier a catastrophist? This is one of the things I say, there was the uniformitarians and the catastrophists, and Cuvier was a catastrophist. So the big flood or something. That is not true. So, whoever we're the good guys, and so we stereotype, anybody who disagrees with us. So that's what happens to the extent that Cuvier is considered to be a catastrophist. I'm going to get an analogy here. So is Thomas Kuhn a catastrophist in the theory of knowledge? So Kuhn's revolution thesis opposed the logical, mathematical, mechanical model of knowledge and nature, corresponding nature of reality. So I think that Kuhn is not a catastrophist, a knowledge catastrophist, because it's cumulative and it's progressive. So Kuhn and Cuvier see a recursive enabling, a progressive opportunity expanding process. So so he's not just saying, hey, there's this, completely opposed thing. So I also am going to suggest that because of this, just as Kuhn sees the progress of science as not rejecting previous knowledge, but sort of superseding it and understanding it in a new way. I can understand from the spherical Earth theory, I can understand why it was reasonable to the flat Earth was reasonable because we're very small in this very large sphere. So anyway, following Cuvier, one of his things he's known for was the advance of comparative anatomy of the fossil skeleton. So he goes into these fossil skeletons in excruciating detail, and what he was impressed with was the functional unity of the animals. And this has been for the paleontology, this is like a really central thing. So each part of the skeleton that they would find contributes to the whole of the structure and function of the animal. So this parts whole relations, Cuvier would argue, and the people reconstructing dinosaurs give you the same rap today, that the part whole relation enables reconstruction of the whole animal from a few fragments. Cuvier also argued that you could maintain that you could argue lifestyle from the structures and functions. So the teeth of the carnivores, I could tell you what they ate and so forth, and they were different from the teeth of grazers. And if they had cloven hooves, that tells me something. They're not going to be grabbing animals and eating them. They're going to be grazers and so forth. So he puts all that stuff together, and so sees that the structures and functions also tell you about the doings, what the animals are doing, which is part of the theme here. So here's a really important. So Cuvier follows Galen and Harvey in utilizing teleology. So you recall Harvey sees these valves in the veins that prevent the reverse flow of blood, and that's like that for him was one of the revelations, to see that the blood was circulating, and the structure of the circulatory system, was set up so that the blood would only circulate in one way. So now the methodology is to understand a structure. In order to understand a structure, consider its function, its purpose. So there's, and so anything all these things, structures that you're looking at, say, why is that structure? What is that doing? What is its purpose in the overall of the animal and the animal in its environment? So, and I take it that purpose reflects an intelligent reason for it, is what I'm going to argue. Understanding this link between intelligence of the technological structures and functions and teleology is what I will argue identifies Cuvier with the engineering worldview. And I emphasize teleology here is very different from the teleonomic. This is not automatic, but it's still thing. And you'll see that this idea of reasons for structures and so forth is comes up with brings us back to Leibniz down line here. So chronologically, Cuvier sees a progressive teleological parameter in biological evolution, better structural designs with increasing functional capacity to do things. And his buddy, and some of this is Lamarck, who had been putting forth the idea of the progressive escalator of evolution. And then ontologically, Cuvier begins to imagine the Earth's anatomy and physiology. And in that, he works with Alexander Humboldt, who explored all over the world and looked at different places and started formulating things like why do certain organisms live in certain areas. And it's not just, you know, temperature and things like that, but the water, the chemicals in the soil, and there's an interdependence of different organisms. Like there's a sequence of the development of organisms. So some organisms can live in a certain area because there are other organisms there that facilitate that. Okay, so in summary here, so Cuvier developed a more general engineering view of biogeology, the Earth. And the Earth is creatively emergent in time with a technologically structured and functioning ontology. Such is my argument. And so, of course, this applies to the whole Earth. In the modern terms, the modern Gaia theory, the Earth has an anatomy and physiology. And this was thought to be silly initially, and now it's pretty much standard accepted. And one of the things about this, Lynn Margulis's son, Dorian Sagan, and Eric Snyder put out a book called Into the Cool, about energy flow and stuff. And what they put forth, you got the sun is a hot source, and the space is the cool sink, and in between is the heat engine. There's a standard engineering model of an engine, and they argued is that the Earth is this engine, and because of the flow of energy through the Earth is not absorbing. If the Earth just kept absorbing energy, it just gets heating up. So the Earth radiates out as much energy as it takes in. But in the process, there's something going on in between. And what they argue is that over time, the biosphere, they say the biosphere is an engine that evolves, generating increasing capacity to perform work. So over time, you're getting a better and better and better engine. And it's better at what? It's better at having increasing capacity to perform work. This is like corresponds to Cuvier saying, well, they're more sophisticated, higher organisms. They're able to do more things. They have more capacity to do things. Okay, so now I'm going to make a transition here, and I call this real quick Batterman's questions. I love Robert Batterman's book called The Devil is in the Details. And what Batterman argues, he says, okay, look, guys, look, if uniformity, stability, regularity are not explained by the presence of uniform eternal laws, so we're going to maybe science isn't the whole picture. So then we need to be asking different questions about how to make sense of the ongoing emergence of technological structures and functions of reality. And I really like the way he sets that up and argues it. So I now call it Batterman's question. You know, what it really is the explanation of all these regularities? Why does Galileo's experiment, why does that work here and there? I mean, it's not because they're eternal laws. Then what is it? Okay, so my step 3 here, I'm going to go through quickly. Lyell goes specific about it. He says, I'm doing a cosmology, and cosmology has this, all the laws are the same. Beginning of the universe, the end of the universe, the laws, the processes, everything's the same, uniformity. And he's quite clear that this conflicts with the cosmogonies, which have to do with the creation of the Earth and stuff. He says, well, that's kind of like, yeah, they always go to that, where did it all come from? So I don't care about that. But it's not just how did the universe come about in the beginning, it's really ongoing. So the real debate is between cosmology and a cosmogenic research program. And the problem is, and the question is, can you reduce historical sciences to the hard sciences? I had a chance to talk to Steve Gould about that one time. He goes, absolutely no way. Historical, when I say historical phenomena are uniform in time invariant, it doesn't look likely. Ontological particulars to a uniform spatial invariance. So what I want to do is, so if you look at the presuppositions that define each of these research programs, cosmology and cosmogenic, the scientific presuppositions are not hard to find. So symmetry and conservation, these are, time, space invariant. Things are uniform in time, same laws, processes start to end, uniform in space, continuous ontology, and transitivity. This is, if you call the reversibility of processes in time. So forward and back, up and down, back and forth are transitive. They're just the same. And thermodynamically, I'm not going to go into a lot, but it's thermodynamically the scientific world should be in equilibrium. But on the other hand, the presuppositions of the engineering metaphysics say, so the relationships are non-transitive. There's an irreducible aspect to everything and a non-uniform aspect. This is my intuition that there's a uniqueness to every moment in time and every place. It's not saying it's totally unique, but there's a unique aspect to it. So also that they see the universe as generative, so in some sense it's non-conservative, it has a net productive, and net productive means it has a history, and so it's chronologically historical, the history is cumulative in some sense, there's an ontological structure. There's a lot of talk about complexity theory these days. That's also another way to approach this whole topic. And the universe is in thermodynamic non-equilibrium, which is to say it sort of had this low entropy beginning and it hasn't reached the equilibrium, and why is that? And there's really no explanation of that in standard physics. Okay, so that one consequence of this incompatible presuppositions, I think, is worth commenting on, and that is the engineering research program is underappreciated in the scientific research program. I mean, scientists just don't pay attention to the cosmogenic part. They're just trying to explain it away. And I would say, likewise, Cuvier remains underappreciated within the scientific research program. This is analogous and just the same thing to Vincenti remains underappreciated within the modern scientific research program. Vincenti makes this very wonderful challenge to the scientific epistemology and the whole scientific way of looking at the world, and they just ignore him. Okay, so I'm just going real quick. So how would we actually demonstrate that the limit of this, what I would call Cuvier's ideological push for a scientific research program for uniformitarianism? And you guys have probably all read my book, which I go into in some detail. And I approach it in terms of Popper's question that I put it, what evidence, if it were occur, would lead you to abandon your core defining presuppositions of your research program? So Popper was very much concerned about ideological positions. And I think one of the ideological positions we're dealing with here is science, the scientific worldview. And so I go through this in the book, and it turns out, I mean, there's all sorts of auxiliary hypotheses you can use, and all sorts of ways, like Cuvier and Barrow about averaging things and so forth. But what is it they can't get away from? And I took it as a kind of a surprising answer, because you can't answer it from within science, because in science has this uniformitary, everything's the same thing. And so what I argue is what you need to do in order to show that the scientific research program is incomplete is you need to demonstrate evidence of a formally complementary phenomena. Okay, and complementarity will come big in here as we go. So because quantum theory interpolates two complementary scientific metaphysics, I want to argue that quantum theory can't be understood as a scientific theory. This, I think, clarifies Feynman's remark that nobody understands quantum theory. And what he means is nobody understands it scientifically, because it isn't understandable scientifically. Yet it's very, very useful. So I can still do, I can use quantum theory either one way or another, either emphasizing the particle aspect or the wave aspect and some of a little of each. But it doesn't mean I can make sense of it in terms of one mechanics, in terms of one uniform scientific reality. So you might imagine Lyell's program of uniformitarianism is kind of like trying to explain away the Maxwellian wave phenomenon in favor of a universally uniform Newtonian particle reality. Okay, so this is just historically what happened to the scientific research program in the 20th century in particular. And what we found is complementarity and opposing scientific frameworks. Classical versus statistical mechanics. There's a lot of hand waving that one is reducible to the other. I'm not buying it. These are two quite different ways of looking at, I should talk about clouds and clocks. Classical view is, it talks about clockwork universe, and statistics is kind of like a cloud universe. The obvious prominent one is Newtonian particle mechanics versus Maxwellian wave mechanics. These are not resolvable into one mechanics. Also in thermodynamics, these are other problems. All this change is reversible. The other thing that came up that was quite devastating was chaos theory, which completely undermined the mechanics of motion. This is my favorite Einstein quote. So he says, physics is an attempt to conceptually to grasp reality as it is thought independently of its being observed. In this sense, one speaks of physical reality. He says, in pre-quantum physics, there was no doubt as to how this was to be understood. In Newtonian theory, reality was determined by a material point in space and time. The reason for that is he argues about absolute simultaneity as being presupposed by the Newtonian program. And he says, well, how can you have absolute simultaneity of everything? Well, if everything's happening at the same time, the only way that can happen is it all happens in the same place. So it ends up being a material point in space-time. Maxwell's theory is a field in space and time. And what that means is it's like absolutely non-local. Everything's spread out over everywhere. So think of it today in terms of absolute locality and absolute non-locality. And these are not, these are kind of co-defined opposites. And then he says, well, in quantum theory is not so easily seen what reality is, which you're all probably aware. Well, I was going to say one other thing about that is that what comes out of the Newtonian space-time and Maxwellian space-time, they actually have complementary space-time symmetries. Okay, that's in my book, arguable. So if you accept that there's this chance aspect to reality, this classical and statistical thing, and it's just pretty well there. So you get this rerunning the universe thing, and the Darwinian thing, Gould argues, you got to have some sort of random mutation to get any sort of change at all, and it doesn't change isn't mechanical coming through, by a clockwork process. So you have to have some sort of random thing going on. So he says, well, but if you accept that, then if you were to rerun the history of life, there's no reason to expect the same outcome. And to me, the big kicker is if your theory can't explain in principle, or can't predict in principle what the outcome is going to be, then you can't explain what happened after the fact with the same theory. I mean, if you can't predict it, then you can't explain it. And the Darwinians kind of get into this and they say, they say, oh, what is evolution? What is the parameter of evolution? They go like, oh, it's change. Says nothing. And John Barrow picks up this Gould's theme quite explicitly and talks about rerunning the cosmos and comes to the same about this book called The Constants of Nature. And says, what reason do we have to believe the constants, there's like 20 of them or something like that, gravity, speed of light, mass of the elementary particles. These are not derivable from basic theory. We just measure them and that's what they are. And if we reran the cosmos, what reason do we have to believe it'd be the same as zero? Okay, so again, this clockwork thing, Sean Carroll points out that based on just the physics itself, the most likely state of any universe, according to the scientific worldview, is equilibrium. So if it's not in equilibrium, well, why? Well, we don't have any explanation of that. And Barrow has this other thing. If you add up all the charges and motions in the universe because of symmetry, they're basically, the universe adds up to nothing. And my friend Peter Atkins takes this quite a wonderful thing, and he's talking about conjuring universe. he says, actually, I wanted to let you guys know, he says, there's really no difficulty in this tradition of this historic thing about, can you create the universe from nothing, ex nihilo? And he says, it's not a problem because the universe is nothing. So I'm starting from nothing and I'm creating nothing. It's nothing because it all adds up to nothing, adds up to zero. Now, this whole Big Bang thing came up, and Hoyle didn't like it at all. He tried to come up with a steady state model of the universe. Is very similar in some philosophical base as Lyell did with his dynamic equilibrium. But pretty much nobody buys that anymore. And Steve Weinberg, also in this wonderful little book, First 3 Minutes, really outlines that the universe has a history of symmetry breaking events. And in that sense, the universe is clearly non-uniform in time, chronologically non-uniform. Okay, so we're in a mess here. So we need to have a paradigm shift. And I'm arguing from a limited scientific view to a more general engineering framework. And I like Dewey gives 2 different representations of inquiry, the spectator and the participant. And spectators are detached observers. This is scientists. They're looking for some sort of objective description of reality. And the participants, on the other hand, they're not worried about that. They're embodied agents and essential components of reality. And they ask different questions and so forth. Okay, so another person who went along this line, John Wheeler, put forth this idea of participatory universe. It wasn't alone. And he just says observer system genesis. And this idea that when you collapse the wave function, you actualize potential. And if you don't have somebody doing that, or somehow some process by which that's happening, then you don't have any universe. And so I think he argues that quantum theory, for instance, should be understood as a participant theory. So I'm not going to try and resolve that here. I'll go into it a little bit later. So anyway, no longer a participant in that. And I like, this is Wolfgang Pauli, who was one of the founders of quantum theory, sees the same shift. So the new pattern of thought, we do not assume any longer the detached observer occurring in the idealizations of this classical type of theory, but an observer who by his indeterminate effects creates a new situation, theoretically described as a new state of the observed system. We'll get into that. Indeterminate is quite important in all that. Okay, so last step. Now, the reason for this is there was this movement in 17th century French engineering, and a lot of it was centered around the École Polytechnique. People coming into it and later graduating from it, and they really developed an engineering worldview, and a lot of it is similar to Plato and so forth. Now, two people who I quite liked, two of my heroes in all this, Gaspard Monge and Lazare Carnot, were the kind of official founders of the École Polytechnique. And it's been argued it was the first engineering university or engineering-focused university, kind of like our MIT and Caltech, supposedly. And interesting, most of the names in the Eiffel Tower were, if you look at them, they all either went into or came out of École Polytechnique. And some impressive characters here from Lagrange and Laplace, and anyway, you get the idea here. Coulomb, Cauchy, Carnot, Prony, anyway, Poisson, Argio. Anyway, incredible. All these people focus around that. So now, in reviewing this thing, I want to kind of come after 2 things. One is I want to look at Leibniz's initiation of this shift from statics to dynamics. Then I'm going to look at this guy, Maupertuis, who articulates the complementarity connection and the concept of action and the existential aspect of that. And I'm going to point out that Planck was very interested in this concept of action. Leibniz also puts forth the idea that the universe is an intelligent animal engine, and he also has this principle of sufficient reason, best of all possible worlds. I kind of go through this real quick. And then finally, Lazare Carnot gives the more general character of the engineering view, which I think is the best. Okay, so 50 years prior to École Polytechnique, roughly, Leibniz starts things with he introduces his new concept in mechanics called dynamics. I mean, he invents the word. And it comes up, it gets kicked around in terms of what's called the Viva Debate. And roughly speaking, what the Viva Debate there was the Cartesians and the Newtonians, or Laplacian Newtonians. And the question of what is the correct mechanics? And we seem to have two. And what's going to define your mechanics is what is conserved. So your rational mechanics, your whole logical mathematical structure depends on what property is conserved in that. And there were two. One is mv, momentum, and another is mv squared. So in this move, though, from statics to dynamics, I'm going to argue is moving from a rational scientific mechanics to a dynamic engineering mechanics. Now, although all this stuff is in Leibniz, I find it easier to understand in terms of Maupertuis, who deals with it 50 years later, because Leibniz is pretty obscure at the time, and some people have read him, and he writes all over the place. So we're still picking out all his different writings. So I think it's easier to put this stuff forth in terms of Maupertuis. And then Maupertuis is accused of stealing all this from Leibniz, but I don't really care. So in this these are controversy where we have two mechanics with different principles of conservation. And so which one's the right one? Well, Maupertuis' answer was both. Well, how can you have both? You know, they're complementary, they're opposites, they don't fit together. One does not derive from the other. They're separate, independent. And so Maupertuis introduces this new idea, this new theory of change. And he says all change is an action. And action for him is dualistic, with an irreducible aspect of both mv and mv squared, both complementary components. So action itself, I want to point, is non-mechanical or post-mechanical because it's composed of two complementary mechanics. So there's no underlying mechanics, there's no common denominator, there's no underlying mechanics from which these two are derivable. And this is very analogous, more than an analogy, I think, but analogous to particle and wave mechanics, that quantum theory incorporates both of those, but those two different mechanics are not derivable from some more fundamental mechanics. Quantum theory is not a mechanical theory. And Du Bois says something similar as far as that both of Maupertuis is all change in quantum theory has an irreducible aspect of both particle and wave, two particle mechanics and wave mechanics. So anyway, I want to argue that quantum theory can't be a mechanical theory, same sense. And this is like, we know this old thing keeps coming up. Feynman, you know, if you think you understand quantum mechanics, you don't understand quantum mechanics. Or he says, I think I can say, when he got his Nobel Prize, I think I can say that nobody understands quantum mechanics. So I want to clarify this by saying what he should be saying is, you think you can understand quantum mechanics as a mechanical scientific theory, you don't understand it, because it's not a scientific theory. Yet it is the most successful theory in history. And my experimentalist physicist friends go like, boy, there's all this stuff about how to understand quantum theory is really, really interesting. But, you know, I don't need to understand it to be able to use it and apply it. This is crucial. Okay, so, and just to emphasize this connection, Maupertuis' action reemerges. It's ignored for a long time in classical mechanics that dominates in the 18th or 19th century into the 20th, even today. But action reemerges, and it's Planck recognizes it, and he recognizes that the Maupertuis' action, which he later sees as Leibniz, he starts being obsessed about Maupertuis, and then people point out to him that actually Leibniz is the one that came up with this originally. But the action in the Maupertuis Leibniz thing is actually the same as the action in the quantum of action, and that's for real. So one thing Maupertuis points out, he says all actions are doings. This is really crucial. So for some purpose or reason. So for instance, what engineers do are actions because they're doing things. Okay. So Maupertuis comes to his engineered technologies. He says all structures and functions in the universe are optimizations of complementary components. You always have a little bit of MV, a little bit of MV squared. And his simplest example to get hold of is a regular orbit. And he points out, he says, the creation of a regular orbit is like the solution to an engineering problem. So you're optimizing these two things. Anybody who played with these, when we were first launching satellites, they used to have all these computer games where, can you launch a satellite? It's not easy to get a satellite to go in a regular orbit. You have to inject it at exactly the right angle and the right velocity at the right elevation to get it to stay in a regular orbit. Otherwise, it starts going wow around and it crashes back into the Earth. So now Euler, this is very similar, I think, to Feynman's comment. Euler says, yes, of course, Beauportray, you're correct. The universe is just like that. This isn't very useful. All right, that's okay. So Beauportray's ontological design. So the stable, regular, middle ground reality was and is creatively constructed by intelligent middle way engineering optimization. And I just suggest this is a possible answer approach to Batterman's question about alternative count of regularities. Why are there regularities in the world? Well, it has to do with the way that the reality was created. Okay, so back to Leibniz, just to review real quick, obvious stuff. He had all this stuff 50 years before Beauportray. There's a big controversy. There's no question in my mind he had it all, and he had that and more. But he comes to this principle of sufficient reason. This is about reason, okay? In a participant engineering worldview is concerned with understanding the reasons for action and the reasons for the structures and functions. The causes are secondary. I mean, the causes are fine, but the structures and functions of reality cannot be accounted for as a result of mechanical causes, of just of a cause. You know, oh, this was caused by such and such. No, they aren't caused. Any of the real structures and functions of reality are optimizations, and they're not. You can't of complementary types of causes, and so they're not. So anyway, so the move then is to start talking about reasons. We want to understand reality, you talk about reasons for this and reasons for that. That's how we understand reality, pretty commonsensical, really. So the reasons for actions in engineering practice, the purposes are always about value of the task. Okay, I'm going to recall Herb Simon's thing about the engineering agenda here, that what engineering is trying to do is to move from a current state of affairs to a more desirable state of affairs. So there's obviously this value component in that, more desirable. And in engineering, emerging engineering worldview, it's always then the best of all possible worlds. And this is, again, Timaeus's comment that certainly the universe always moves to the good. It's pretty much the same statement. So Leibniz has also this like an organismic engine ontology. The human body is a hydraulico-pyrotechnic machine. I mentioned it's an engine because it generates any. And he goes, any machine is best understood in terms of its final cause, which is to say its purpose. It's a reason for it, so that each part is coordinated with others for the intended use. This is Cuvier's revelation about in his comparative anatomy, seeing that all the parts of the organism, you know, are coordinated and work together. And so what is the organisms? The organizing principle is its final cause, its reason, possibly Aristotle's entelechy. So anyway, reality, according to him, is an engine composed of engines. So it's engines all the way up, all the way down. And in the Timaeus, Plato also argues that the universe is an animal. Okay, so, but I want to point out that Leibniz's dynamic equilibrium is not mechanically symmetric. It's not action-reaction canceling. It's not zero sum. So I don't think it's much in the literature, but I think Leibniz has thermodynamics well before the Carnots, because any model that's thermodynamically generative, or this generative is thermodynamic is generative, in my opinion. So what you get instead of the action-reaction opposites is you get cycles of generation. So in the Gaia theory, well, anyway, I'm going to that. So finally, Carnot puts forth a very nice participant engineering view. And he starts out by saying he's concerned that there aren't any engineers in the rational mechanical world. In the scientific worldview, you know, where are the engineers? You know, like they don't seem to be there. And so he gets specific about it. He says, you know, in engineering practice, there's this principle. He says there's always a trade-off of velocity, time, and power. And then he goes on. He says there's no rational mechanics can account for this basic engineering principle. And what it means is that engineers have options on accomplishing a task. In other words, they can do it faster, they can do it slower. They can use pulleys and less power and takes more time, or they can do it faster, so forth. So when an engineer approaches a task, he always has options. Okay, and this options thing, I would argue, engineers have a constrained free will, and this is Florman's existential engineering again. Okay, so for Carnot, that, you know, it's sort of, again, quantum theory, if you like, that the path to the future is indeterminate. It's constrained, but it's open until the engineer's actions actualize a potential. So I'm going to say, if you really want to understand the collapse of the wave function, it's the action of an agent. You know, somebody's actualizing a potential. Now, if the world's completely made of agents, then you don't have to worry about, oh, you don't need a human observer. No, all you need is agent, and the whole world is agency, so you don't have any problem. Anyway, so I say it's an analogy to collapsing the wave function in Schrodinger's thing, but I think it's more than an analogy. So the optimum path of engineering is always necessarily a middle way between dual complementary mechanical ideals, the fastest and the slowest, so forth. Now, what Carnot does with this principle of velocity, time, and power, and trade-off with power, is he introduces a time dimension to change, to action. In action, it has a time dimension. And you know, for those of you familiar with thermodynamics, this simply means that engineering change is path dependent, whereas mechanical change is path independent. And so by adding time, you're adding a dimension, and so that I want to argue that the conceptual framework of engineering is more general. It's able to understand the mechanical stuff, the path independent arguments and so forth, Lagrange and stuff, but it's a more general framework, and more general than any possible scientific framework, any possible framework that's completely based on path independent, you know, deterministic change. Okay, so Carnot's, well, anyway, Carnot goes, Euler, Lagrange have this deterministic principle of least action using the calculus of variation, very nice, and it's nice for solving problems and stuff, but it ignores, it doesn't have any dissipation, it's clearly an idealization. And what Carnot does is he puts the engineer, the participant in the driver's seat here, and he says, well, wait a minute, what's important here is this optimization. So the principle of least action, which supposedly you can calculate and everything, is nice, but it's an idealization. So the reality is that engineering practice operates on the principle of optimization. So when you're making choices, you know, how strong material, you want to build it this way, you want to do it that way, you're always looking for the optimum solution to your task. And so this comes up in Sadi Carnot is son. He's an extension of Lazar's foundational contributions. And the key thing here, it's not really, but basically the up cycle and the down cycle are complementary, and that's why you get the area in between, where there's an area in there, the sort of orange area in the middle there. That's the product. That's what's generated, and the reason it's generated is because the up cycle and the down cycle are complementary, and they just keep going like a pendulum, sort of. These are two hypotheses at the end here. So Lazar's participant engineering thermodynamics is the proper basis for understanding the chronological and ontological design of the engineering worldview. And I also go a little further. Lazar's participant engineering thermodynamics is a proper basis for understanding quantum theory and quantum reality. Brief summary. So I want to argue that reality is intelligible in terms of participatory engineering view. The structures and functions of reality are technological creations. And then I went into the relation between science and engineering. And I went through these 5 steps, hopefully bringing you back in the end from 17th century engineering back to the modern engineering view. And So conclusions: Boulero, Vincente, Florman, Simon offer an engineering challenge to the scientific worldview. The engineering epistemology points towards an alternative engineering ontology. The central image was the engine. In the engineering worldview, reality has a technological structure and function. The individual embodied components are active, intelligent technologies. Following Galen, Harvey, and Cuvier, to understand the embodied components, what they are and what they do, one must seek to understand their purpose and value in the overall technological structure and function of reality. The engineering worldview is more general, subsuming and superseding the complementary mechanics of the modern scientific worldview. Leibniz, Marpurtue, and Carnot further illuminate the engineering worldview, and I related their views back to the moderns. Carnot advocated for an engineering worldview. An adequate understanding of reality must include participant engineers in engineering. I formulated in my own mind here, I call Carnot's epiphany, that we're engineers in a world of engineering. Those are my hypotheses, so to speak, but that's going to be it. So that's all I have to say about that.